In the late 1960s, the remote village of San Vicente de la Sierra, nestled in the shadow of the Sierra Escura Mountains in northern Mexico, was little more than a forgotten settlement. With a population of just over 60 people, the villagers lived in near isolation, eking out a humble living from farming and livestock. The strangers were the Hernandez brothers, Julio and Rafael, smooth-talking drifters who had been making their way across Mexico, living off scams and false promises. It was unclear whether they were originally from San Vicente or simply passing through, but by 1970, they arrived in the village, eager to start a new venture. They claimed to be prophets of a mysterious ancient religion, and they quickly made their presence known. Their message was simple but compelling. The villagers had been chosen to worship the divine ancients, powerful deities who had been cast out of the world of men long ago. The Hernandez brothers promised that these gods would bless the village with great fortune treasures hidden deep within the mountains. But of course there was a catch. The villagers were told that to access these treasures they must offer tribute. What seemed like a harmless enough request quickly turned into something far darker. The brothers began holding elaborate ceremonies, where they performed miracles that convinced the villagers of their divine powers. The rituals took place in secret locations within the mountains, where Julio and Rafael claimed they could commune with the gods. As the ceremonies grew in frequency, so did the demands. In exchange for promises of riches, the villagers were expected to make offerings: money, food, and, increasingly, young women. The Hernandez brothers told the villagers that their godly patrons required gifts of the flesh as part of their worship. The girls, some as young as 13, were taken from their homes to serve the gods. Despite growing whispers of discontent, no one dared to defy the brothers for fear of the wrath they claimed would come from the divine. By late 1971, the situation had escalated. What had begun as a strange but seemingly harmless cult had begun to take on a far more dangerous tone. The rituals became increasingly debauched, drug-fueled orgies, sacrificial rites, and violent ceremonies in which the villagers were forced to partake. But Julio and Rafael were not content with simply manipulating the villagers for their own gain. They began to manipulate their minds, convincing them that the divine ancients would soon return to Earth, and only those who remained faithful would survive the coming apocalypse. As the cult's influence grew, a new figure emerged: Alma Reyes, a 19-year-old from the neighboring town of El Paso de los Reyes. Alma, a troubled and vulnerable young woman, was drawn to the Hernandez brothers after they visited her town, claiming to be able to unlock the secrets of the universe. Alma had a troubled past, marked by a history of abuse and exploitation. When the brothers offered her the chance to become a key figure in their religious movement, she accepted, believing they could offer her the validation and power she craved. Alma was introduced to the villagers as Ixchel, a powerful goddess from ancient Mayan mythology. Unlike the vague, foreign gods the Hernandez brothers had first claimed to represent, Ixchel was a familiar name, and the villagers accepted Alma as their goddess with little resistance. The brothers performed a grand ceremony to reveal her as the incarnation of Ixchel, bringing her out of a mist of smoke, wearing a feathered headdress and adorned with elaborate jewelry. The villagers, already primed to believe in supernatural forces, fell in line without question. But things quickly took a turn for the worse. The moment Alma assumed the role of goddess, her already fragile mind cracked. She began to believe, fully and completely, that she was a divine being, capable of demanding anything she desired. Her worshippers were no longer just required to give offerings, they had to cater to her every whim. Under Alma's rule, the rituals grew even darker, the demands more grotesque. By mid-1972, Alma had turned the village into a nightmare. She introduced peyote into the ceremonies, claiming it would bring her closer to the gods. But the drug only deepened her delusions, and soon she was ordering human sacrifices those who dared to question the cult's teachings or showed any sign of defiance. The first victim was a young woman named Rosa, who had grown disillusioned with the cult and attempted to leave. Alma, enraged, declared her a traitor to the gods and ordered her to be sacrificed. Rosa was tortured and mutilated in front of the other followers, her blood mixed with that of a goat, and the mixture consumed by Alma as a divine offering. The brutality did not stop with Rosa. As time went on, more villagers were killed in similar rituals, their hearts ripped from their bodies and consumed in the name of the gods. The Hernandez brothers, once the leaders of the cult, found themselves increasingly sidelined as Alma took control. But the brothers were too greedy to protest. They continued to benefit from the power and resources the cult provided, and so they kept quiet as Alma spiraled further into madness. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread outside of San Vicente. In early 1973, a local boy named Lucas Delgado, only 15 years old, ventured into the mountains to hunt. While passing through the woods, he stumbled upon one of the cult's secret ritual sites. He witnessed the grisly scene of a sacrificial ceremony in progress. Alma and her followers were in the midst of another blood ritual, this time involving the sacrifice of a local priest who had dared to confront Alma's authority. Horrified, Lucas fled, running the 20 miles to the nearest town, Veracruz. Lucas, shaking with fear, arrived at the Veracruz police station, where he told officers about the murders and the cult's dark rituals. At first, the story was dismissed as a fantasy, but one officer, Captain Enrique Salazar, believed Lucas and decided to investigate further. Salazar and a small team of officers made their way to San Vicente, but they didn't make it far. Salazar and his team were ambushed by cult members, and only one officer managed to escape, badly wounded. The authorities realized the scale of the threat and called in reinforcements. Mexican military personnel who descended upon San Vicente in late January 1973. The raid was swift and violent. Alma Reyes, along with Julio and Rafael Hernandez, was captured, but not without resistance. Alma attempted to flee but was cornered and arrested. The cult's followers, many of whom were terrified and unwilling to testify, offered no resistance when taken into custody. A search of the cult's compounds revealed the remains of several victims. Most of them were unrecognizable, their bodies mutilated beyond repair. In the aftermath, the surviving cult members were put on trial. Alma Reyes was sentenced to life imprisonment, but it was reported that she died in prison in 1976, possibly from injuries sustained during her arrest. The Hernandez brothers were also convicted, with Julio sentenced to death for his role in the murders and Rafael serving a lengthy sentence. The villagers who had participated in the cult's activities faced prison terms ranging from 10 to 30 years. Today, the story of the cult of Ixchel is remembered as one of Mexico's darkest chapters. The survivors of San Vicente continue to tell their stories, and while the village has since recovered, the shadows of the past still linger. The name of Alma Reyes, the false goddess, is a reminder of how easily people can be deceived and how destructive that deception can be. In 2017, emergency services were called to the scene of a devastating fire in the sleepy town of Crestwood in the U.S. Nestled in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, Crestwood was the type of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened. The town's Wikipedia page could fit onto a single line, and the idea of it becoming famous for anything seemed laughable until it wasn't. On the night of the fire crews arrived, hoses in hand, only to find something far worse than the usual damage from flames. The house, a two-story family home on the outskirts of town, had been engulfed in flames, but there had been no calls for help, no signs of life. No one had been inside, at least not at first glance. Fires could start for all kinds of reasons, wiring issues, maybe, or something more mundane, but this one wasn't a random accident. As the firefighters doused the flames and began searching the debris, they found 4 bodies, 4 brutalized victims who had died long before the fire had ever started. Among them was 47-year-old Emma Scott, her teenage sons, Max and Luke, and Max's girlfriend, 20-year-old Mia Harris. The crime scene revealed a scene of unimaginable horror. All 4 victims were bound, their throats slashed, some victims had been stabbed, and the youngest, Max, showed signs of unspeakable abuse. The fire was a cover-up, a last desperate attempt to erase the evidence of a much darker crime. The only survivor was Emma's partner, a man named Greg, who had been at work when the fire began. Investigators initially turned their attention to Greg, but it quickly became clear that he wasn't responsible. There was no sign of foul play from him, but there was something else, something far more chilling. DNA and fingerprints belonging to an unknown male were found scattered throughout the house, leading the authorities to an eerie discovery: someone had been watching them, someone who knew exactly when to strike. The police offered a reward of $150,000 for any information that could lead to the killer, hoping it would prompt someone to come forward. The press quickly gave him a name: the Phantom of Crestwood. The moniker stuck, and the hunt began. But the authorities had a clue, a thread to follow that would lead them to the truth, though it was anything but straightforward. Enter the unlikely heroes of the case: Google and the family dog. Investigators, with the help of Google's parent company, Alphabet, traced IP addresses that had been used to search for Emma and her family in the days leading up to the murders. There wasn't much of a trail, but there was one address that stood out: a man named Nathan Moore, a 34-year-old youth sports coordinator who lived just a few blocks from the Scott household. Moore was a seemingly upstanding member of the community, well-liked, no criminal record, no history of violence. But there was one odd detail that raised suspicion: Moore had 2 large, hyperactive huskies, known for their loud howling and constant energy. Neighbors remembered seeing him walking the dogs every morning at the same time, without fail until the morning of the murders. On that day, however, the dogs seemed reluctant to leave the house. Police cross-checked Moore's phone records, and sure enough, his phone had left his house that morning, wandering around Crestwood before returning home, except on the morning of the murders, the phone never left his house. The police, eager to confirm their suspicions, set up a routine checkpoint in Crestwood. Nathan Moore was stopped while driving, asked to blow into a breathalyzer as part of the town's regular DUI checks. When the breathalyzer registered normal, they swapped out the tube and sent it to the lab for DNA analysis. The results were damning. The DNA found in Moore's saliva matched the samples collected from the crime scene. On June 22, 2018, Moore was arrested. Investigators searched his home and found cable ties, duct tape, a handgun, and homemade restraints, all pointing to the same dark truth. He confessed to the murders. Moore admitted to having entered the house on the morning of the attack, pretending to be a school counselor in search of a missing child. Once inside, he bound the family, held them hostage while Emma went to withdraw money from a nearby bank, and then, after assaulting and torturing them, he murdered the victims before setting the house ablaze. Why? What could drive a man to commit such a gruesome act? Moore's chilling answer was simple: he was a predator, a pedophile who had been watching the family for some time. The presence of Max, Emma's 14-year-old son, had been his trigger. Investigators would later uncover that Moore had been stalking 2 other families, considering them as potential victims. In March 2019, Nathan Moore was convicted of murder, extortion, kidnapping, assault, and arson. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole under strict conditions a slim chance at best, considering the brutality of his crime. At his trial, the lead prosecutor called Moore's actions cold-blooded and devoid of empathy. As of today, Moore remains locked away in a maximum security facility in Pennsylvania, but the legacy of the Phantom of Crestwood still lingers. The quiet town of Crestwood, which once seemed so safe, now holds the shadow of a man who could have been anyone: the neighbor, the friend, the coach, reminding us that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of faces. On the morning of June 3, 1989, a delivery driver pulled up to the door of the Golden Lotus Inn in the coastal city of Ningbo, China, situated near the bustling harbor. The Golden Lotus Inn was a local favorite, serving both fresh seafood and traditional Chinese dishes to locals and tourists alike. The driver had been making regular deliveries to the restaurant for months, and everything seemed to be in order the day before, but as he approached, he was greeted by a strange notice on the door: closed for 3 days. This was odd. The driver had made his delivery the day before, and no one had mentioned anything about closing. Curious, he decided to make a detour and visit the family's house to check in. He knew the restaurant was family-run, with the patriarch, Li Wei, starting his business as a street vendor in the 1950s before turning it into the bustling inn it was today. The family was well known in Ningbo, and the driver had worked with them for years. However, when he knocked on the door, it was not answered by anyone he recognized. Instead, a strange man in his 50s greeted him. The man explained that the Lai family had left suddenly on an urgent trip to the mainland. The driver found this odd but didn't push further. There was something unsettling about the man's demeanor, but it wasn't until he noticed the man's left hand that he felt something truly wrong. The tip of his left index finger was missing. The driver left, assuming it was a strange encounter, but he would soon realize that he was the last person to see the Lai family alive. 3 days later, on June 6th, a local fisherman spotted a bundle of severed limbs washed up on the rocky shores of Ningbo's eastern beach. The police were called immediately, and at first they suspected the body parts might belong to refugees from mainland China, as the waters around Ningbo had become notorious for dangerous boat crossings. But a closer examination revealed something far more sinister. The body parts had been severed with precision, and there were at least 4 distinct bodies. As more body parts washed ashore over the next week, police began to wonder if there was a connection to the missing Lai family. The reports matched too closely. 10 members of the Li family had vanished without a trace, and now the body parts seemed to confirm their worst fears. Investigators focused their attention on the Golden Lotus Inn, which had been eerily silent during the days the family had been missing. The man who had been running the restaurant in their absence was an enigmatic figure named Wu Kai. Wu was a man of many names. He had been born Zhou Jian in Beijing, but after years of moving from place to place, he adopted several identities, including Wu Kai, and eventually wound up in Ningbo. He was known to have spent a lot of time around the Lai family, and neighbors recalled seeing him often at the restaurant. When the police questioned Wu, they found that his story was full of holes. He had suddenly taken over the restaurant and even had all the necessary ownership documents. But something about the whole situation felt off. He had no family ties to the Lies, yet he was now managing everything, even renting out their house. It was strange, and when the police began examining Wu's financial records, they found evidence linking him to the missing family bank accounts containing documents that belonged to Lai Wei, along with a student ID that belonged to one of his children. Suspicious, the authorities dug deeper. Wu attempted to flee to the mainland, but he was captured by police in late October 1989, nearly 4 months after the family's disappearance. By this time, Wu was already a suspect in the grisly killings of the Lai family, but still, there were no bodies. The investigation into Wu's background revealed that he had lived a life full of deception. His financial problems, including gambling debts, may have been a motive for the gruesome murders. In late October, Wu was charged with the murders of all 10 members of the Li family, based on circumstantial and physical evidence. But that was only the beginning. On November 2nd, a fellow inmate at the Ningbo Central Prison attacked Wu, leaving him severely injured. 3 days later, Wu tried to escape, but he failed. Finally, on November 10th, Wu made a confession. What Wu claimed happened that night in August of 1988 remains chilling. According to Wu, he had been involved in high-stakes gambling with Li Wei, the restaurant's owner. Li had racked up a massive debt over 300,000 yuan, which was around $50,000 at the time, and when the Li Lai family failed to pay him back, Wu took matters into his own hands. He claimed that the Lai family was too deep in debt, and as their financial troubles worsened, they made a deal with Wu. If they couldn't pay the money back within a year, they would sign over ownership of the restaurant. But when the Li family failed to meet the deadline, Wu confronted them at the restaurant late one night in August 1988. He demanded his money, but Li Wei refused. The argument escalated quickly, with Wu eventually threatening Li's young son. As tensions reached their peak, Wu stabbed the boy and then proceeded to kill each member of the family, one by one, using a broken beer bottle and strangulation. Wu claimed that during this time he heard a knock at the door. It was Li Wei's sister, who was soon caught and killed as well. Wu spent the next several hours dismembering the bodies, packing the remains into black trash bags and discarding them in dumpsters. He then stole money and keys to the safe before leaving the scene and spending the night at Lai Wei's house. The following morning, he calmly told the delivery driver that the family had gone away. But Wu's attempts to cover up the murders didn't last. On December 4th, 1989, Wu took his own life in his prison cell after making several unsuccessful attempts. His final confession, written in a letter to a local newspaper, claimed that his death was unrelated to his crimes. He blamed his chronic asthma. Authorities later found a chilling link between Wu's fingerprints and an unsolved murder in Hong Kong from 1975, revealing that his violent tendencies had a long history. As for the Li family, their remains were never fully recovered, and their disappearance remains a grim chapter in the history of Ningbo. The Golden Lotus Inn, which had been reopened by Wu after the murders, became a place of dark urban legend. Rumors spread that Wu had served human meat to his customers, though there's little evidence to support such claims. However, in 1992, Hong Kong director Tony Chung made a film based on the horrifying events, titled The Golden Lotus, which later became known internationally as The Human Meat Bun. The film earned millions of dollars and captured the grisly tale of betrayal, violence, and death that had once haunted the Golden Lotus Inn.